Belgium, December 1944. A canvas tent behind the American front line in the Ardennes. Outside, the coldest winter anyone can remember has turned the forest to iron. Inside, a young sergeant in a wool uniform leans across a rough wooden table toward a captured German soldier. He is 22 years old. His accent, when he speaks German, is not the careful, slightly wrong German of a foreign student who learned it from a textbook. It is the real thing. It is the German of a boy who grew up in the town of Hildesheim, who went to the opera with his parents on weekends, who was raised on the same songs and jokes and street names as the frightened prisoner sitting across from him. The prisoner assumes he is speaking to a fellow German. He is not. He is speaking to a Jewish refugee whose family this prisoner's own army had already destroyed. The sergeant does not shout. He offers a cigarette. He asks, almost casually, how the prisoner was captured. He talks a little about home, about the towns they both know, about how tired everyone is of this war. And the prisoner, relaxing into the strange comfort of hearing his own language, spoken perfectly by his captor, begins to talk. Where is your unit? How many tanks does it have left? How much fuel? What did your officers tell you about what comes next? The answers come more easily than the prisoner ever intended. What he does not know, what almost no one in that tent could have guessed, is that the young interrogator across from him had tried to serve the United States and had been turned away. Not once, but in two different ways. Once by a recruiter who told him, in plain words, that the country did not want men like him, and once by a policy of the United States government that classified him, on paper, as an enemy of the very nation he was trying to defend. His name was Günther Stern. In America, they called him Guy, and the strange, almost unbelievable fact at the center of his story is this. The United States had every reason, on paper, to keep him out of the war entirely. He was foreign-born. He was a German national, living in a country at war with Germany. He was, in the coldest bureaucratic language of the moment, an enemy alien. And yet by the winter of 1944, this rejected refugee was doing intelligence work at the headquarters of an entire American field army, in the middle of the largest and bloodiest battle the United States Army would fight in the whole of the Second World War. How does a man the system tried to shut out end up near the center of its most desperate fight? The answer is not a story about one lucky exception slipping through a crack in the wall. It is a story about a weapon the American war machine very nearly failed to understand it was holding. A weapon that had nothing to do with tanks or aircraft or heavy guns. It was the accumulated knowledge locked inside the heads of the very people the Nazis had driven out of Germany. The language, the culture, the fears, the pride, the intimate, unteachable understanding of how the enemy actually thought. And it took the United States Army an embarrassingly long time, and the rejection of thousands of men exactly like Guy Stern, to figure out what it possessed. To understand why the rejection happened at all, you have to understand how the United States saw men like Stern in the first uncertain days of the war. And to understand that, you have to go back to where he came from, and to the family he could not save. Günther Stern was born in Hildesheim, Germany, on January 14, 1922. His father, Julius, made his living selling clothing materials. His mother was named Hedwig. He had a younger brother, Werner, and a younger sister, Eleanor. It was a comfortable, cultured, middle-class Jewish household of a kind that had existed in German towns for centuries. Stern loved books. He loved music. He and his parents would go to the theater and the opera together. He was, by every account, the bright and promising eldest child on whom a great deal of family hope quietly rested. He was 11 years old, almost to the week, when Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933. And over the next 4 years, the world that the Stern family had always known closed in around them, one law at a time, one humiliation at a time. Jewish businesses were boycotted, then seized outright. Jewish children were pushed out of schools. The ordinary machinery of a normal life, the ability to earn a living, to study, to sit in a park, to walk down a street without fear, was dismantled deliberately and methodically by the state. By 1937, the Stern parents had arrived at the single most painful calculation a family can be forced to make. They could not all get out. The doors of the world were closing, and the money and the visas and the sponsors required were beyond reach for 4 people. But perhaps they could save one. And so they chose their eldest, the boy with the future, and they sent him across an ocean to an uncle in St. Louis, Missouri, helped along by a quiet Jewish relief organization, in the desperate hope that he would live, and that once established, he might be able to open a door for the rest of them. He was 15 years old when he sailed. He would never see his mother, his father, his brother, or his sister again. He tried. This is one of the details that makes the whole story so hard to sit with. Once safe in America, the teenage Stern did everything a boy with almost no money and no power could do to pull the rest of his family across after him. He wrote letters. He chased affidavits and sponsors. He ran headlong into the wall that trapped so many Jewish families in exactly those years. A wall built of immigration quotas and paperwork, and closing borders, and official indifference on both sides of the Atlantic. The very door that had let him through was swinging shut behind him. His parents, his brother Werner, and his sister Eleanor were eventually caught in the machinery of the Holocaust and deported to the Warsaw Ghetto in occupied Poland. None of them survived. Guy Stern was the only member of his immediate family to escape. Hold that fact in your mind, because everything that follows rests on it. Here was a young man with more reason than almost any American alive to want to fight Nazi Germany. That regime had taken his home, his country, and eventually his entire family, and when he finally tried to offer himself to the war against it, the country he had adopted looked at him and said no. The first rejection came after Pearl Harbor, when Japan attacked in December 1941 and the United States entered the war. Stern, like millions of young men across the country, wanted in. He had been studying languages. He was fluent in exactly the tongue the army would soon need most, and then he saw it. A recruiting appeal from United States Naval Intelligence, calling for precisely what he was, men with a skill in foreign languages and a knowledge of enemy culture. He could not have been better matched if the notice had been written with him personally in mind. He presented himself, he offered his credentials, and he was turned down flat. The reason had nothing to do with his ability. As Stern remembered it for the rest of his life, an officer told him that his qualifications were good, but that on the other hand, he was not a native-born American. The Navy, at that moment, would take only men born on American soil. His German birth, the single thing that made him uniquely valuable, was treated as the thing that disqualified him. Sit with the logic of that for just a moment, because it reveals the trap the United States had walked into at the very start of the war. The Navy said it wanted men who understood the enemy from the inside. Standing right in front of them was a man who understood the enemy from the inside as deeply as anyone in the country, and they rejected him precisely because he understood the enemy from the inside. The knowledge and the disqualification were the exact same fact about him. The thing they were looking for, and the thing they were afraid of, were one and the same. This was the first no, and behind it stood a second, larger, more official no that hung over every refugee like Stern. Because it was not merely one cautious recruiter making one cautious decision on one afternoon. It was national policy. After the United States declared war, the federal government formally classified German, Italian, and Japanese nationals living inside the country as enemy aliens. This was not a loose insult. It was a legal category with hard consequences. Enemy aliens were required to register with the government. They faced restrictions on where they could travel and where they could live. Some faced curfews. Some had property seized. Under the selective service system, many were placed into a classification that marked them as unacceptable for regular military service. In the eyes of the wartime state, a German who had fled the Nazis and a German loyal to the Nazis could, at first glance, look like exactly the same security risk. The system was not built to tell the two apart. It was built, at the start, simply to hold all of them at arm's length. So consider carefully the box the United States had locked itself inside. It was at war with Germany. It desperately needed people who could read captured German documents, interrogate German prisoners, understand German military culture, and see straight through German deception. And it was sitting on top of a population of tens of thousands of German speakers who could do every one of those things fluently, who despised the Nazi regime with a personal fury that no American-born soldier could be expected to match, and who wanted nothing on earth more than the chance to help destroy it. And the country's first bureaucratic instinct was to treat those very people as suspects, to turn them away at the recruiting office, to reject them not by accident, but as a matter of standing national policy. If the story simply ended there, it would be nothing more than a sad little account of talent thrown away by a frightened bureaucracy. But it does not end there, because a small number of clear-thinking people inside the American military looked at exactly the same population that the enemy alien policy had walled off, and they asked a completely different question. Not, how do we keep these people out, but, what if these are precisely the people we need most? That question, and the strange institution built to answer it, is where this whole story turns. Before we walk through that turn, one honest word about the shape of what is coming, because this is history and not legend, and the difference between the two matters enormously. The popular way to tell Guy Stern's story is to say that the army rejected him twice, and then he single-handedly cracked the war wide open like a code. The truth is, richer, stranger, and more interesting than that neat little arc, and it deserves to be told accurately. The rejections were real. The naval rejection was personal, and it is well documented in his own words. The enemy alien wall was official and national, and it stood over every refugee in the country. But what Stern did after those rejections was not the lone work of a single hero in a movie. It was the work of a man who became one vital node inside a strange and brilliant collective experiment, an experiment the United States very nearly failed to run at all. And to understand his part in the Battle of the Bulge, you first have to understand that experiment. So let us build it, the way the army eventually did. If accounts like this one matter to you, the forgotten people and the quiet decisions behind the battles everyone thinks they already know, take a second to subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this kind of history reach the people who care about getting it right. In the spring of 1942, while the Navy was still turning men like Stern away at the door, the United States Army quietly opened a training center at a former National Guard site tucked into the Maryland mountains, near a small community called Cascade. The place was named Camp Ritchie. On paper, it was the Military Intelligence Training Center, the Army's first real centralized school for the gathering and analysis of battlefield intelligence. The men who trained there gave it a different, fonder name. They took its official abbreviation and twisted it into a private joke, calling it the Military Institution of Total Confusion. The joke hid something deadly serious. Camp Ritchie was the place where the American military finally decided to do the exact opposite of the enemy alien policy. Instead of treating foreign birth as a disqualification, Camp Ritchie treated foreign birth as a qualification. It went looking for the very men the rest of the system was trying to keep out. The idea behind it was almost embarrassingly simple, once somebody with authority finally said it out loud. The United States was, at that very moment, laboriously training native-born American farm boys and college students to speak halting, textbook German, and to recognize German uniforms and insignia from printed manuals. Meanwhile, walking freely around that same country were tens of thousands of people who already spoke flawless, native German, who already knew the uniforms, not from a manual, but because they had watched men wearing them march through their own hometowns, who already understood the enemy's culture, his regional accents, his slang, his songs, his propaganda, his fears, and his pride, from the inside, because it had once been their own. Why train a clumsy imitation of the enemy's mind, when you could recruit the genuine article and simply point it in the other direction? The men who came out of Camp Ritchie became known, decades later, as the Ritchie Boys. Estimates of how many passed through the camp across the war run to roughly 20,000 soldiers, along with around 2,000 members of the Women's Army Corps. A great many of them were immigrants and refugees, chosen for their command of German, French, Italian, Polish, and dozens of other languages the army suddenly needed. And at the heart of the program was a core group, numbering somewhere around 2,000 men, who were German and Austrian Jews. Men who had fled Nazi persecution, arrived in the United States under the long shadow of that enemy alien label, and then been swept into the very fight they had every personal reason on earth to want. What they were taught at Camp Ritchie went far beyond simple translation. They trained in the interrogation of prisoners of war, which was the camp's central purpose and the army's single greatest recognized weakness. They learned the painstaking discipline of order of battle, the art of reconstructing the entire structure of the enemy's forces, which unit sat next to which, who commanded it, how strong it was, from nothing but scattered scraps of evidence and the careful questioning of frightened men. They learned photo interpretation, reading aerial reconnaissance images for the faint signatures of dug-in guns and hidden vehicles. They learned counterintelligence, the catching of spies and infiltrators. And they learned psychological warfare, the craft of studying and demoralizing an enemy population. Their instructors drilled them relentlessly. Their final examinations tested pure trained observation, sometimes by scattering dozens of pieces of enemy equipment across a field and demanding the men identify every one correctly. Many of them said afterward that the training at Camp Ritchie was harder than anything they would ever study in civilian life. There was one rule at the center of the interrogation training that mattered enormously, both morally and practically. The interrogators were told, flatly, that they could never physically assault a prisoner of war. Violence was forbidden. This was not softness. It was tradecraft. The Ritchie boys discovered, again and again, that the way to open up a captured German was not fear of a beating, but the disarming shock of kindness and familiarity. So they would offer that cigarette. They would commiserate about the miserable weather and the endless war. They would ask an easy opening question, like "How were you taken prisoner?" before circling gently toward what they actually wanted. Many of them deliberately avoided taking notes during a conversation, because the sight of a pencil scratching down every word reminded a prisoner that he was not supposed to be talking at all. It was a quiet, patient, human craft, and it worked far better than brutality ever had. Their work was not confined to the interrogation tent either. The Ritchie boys became the army's voice aimed at the enemy. A portion of them went on to further, specialized training at a smaller site in Pennsylvania called Camp Sharp, where they learned the darker arts of propaganda and psychological warfare in depth. From there they drafted leaflets by the millions and had them dropped from aircraft over German lines. They rode to the very front in trucks mounted with loudspeakers, broadcasting appeals in perfect German, out in the open and often under fire, urging cold and exhausted enemy soldiers to lay down their arms and go home to their families. They produced fake German newspapers and radio broadcasts designed to erode the enemy's will to keep fighting. And one of their most effective creations was a safe conduct leaflet designed to look as though it were personally signed by General Dwight Eisenhower himself, promising any German who carried it fair and decent treatment upon surrender. It played brilliantly on a certain German respect for official, stamped, signed authority. The tone of the message mattered as much as its content. Rather than crude insults, the best of these appeals spoke to a tired soldier's homesickness, to his hunger, to his growing private doubt that the war could still be won. And by the end of the fighting, a great many surrendering German soldiers were clutching exactly that piece of paper as they came across the line with their hands raised. This, then, is the door that finally opened for Guy Stern. About half a year after the Navy rejected him, the general draft swept him into the Army. And here the same machinery that had once excluded him began, quietly, to reverse itself. The Army needed bodies, yes, but more than bodies, it had begun to understand that it needed exactly the rare skills that men like Stern carried around inside their heads. The legal barriers were coming down. Congress had passed wartime measures that allowed foreign-born servicemen, including former enemy aliens, to be naturalized as American citizens on an accelerated basis. Stern was sent first through basic training, learning to handle a rifle like any other soldier. And it was there, near the end of that basic training, that the second rejection was formally erased. Word came down that non-citizens in the ranks should report to be naturalized. Stern was taken to a courthouse and, in a mass ceremony alongside other immigrant soldiers, sworn in as a citizen of the United States. It was around this time that Günther quietly became Guy. It was a practical decision, as much as a personal one, because for a German-born Jew in an American uniform, a German first name discovered upon capture could be a death sentence. Then came the secret orders. Stern was told only that he was shipping out, and that his destination was classified. He rode a train for a full day, forbidden to know where he was going, before he was finally permitted to open his sealed instructions, and discovered that he was bound for Camp Ritchie, Maryland. The rejected refugee was about to be forged into one of the most useful soldiers in the entire European theatre, not in spite of being German, precisely because of it. Now, to feel the full weight of what these men would do in the Ardennes that winter, you have to understand what the Battle of the Bulge actually was. And above all, you have to understand why intelligence, the specific product that the Ritchie boys manufactured, mattered so enormously within it. Because the Bulge was, at its very root, a catastrophe of intelligence before it ever became a triumph of endurance. By December 1944, the war in the West looked, to a great many Allied commanders, as though it were sliding into its final act. The Germans had been driven out of France in a headlong retreat. The front had been shoved all the way up against the German border itself. There was a widespread, comfortable assumption running through the Allied camp that the German army was essentially broken, that it simply lacked the fuel, the men, and the will to launch anything more ambitious than local defensive fighting. And so the heavily forested, steep, difficult region of the Ardennes, straddling eastern Belgium and northern Luxembourg, was treated as a quiet sector, a rest area. It was held thinly, used to season brand new divisions and to let battered ones recover. Soldiers came to call it the Ghost Front. The American 106th Infantry Division, freshly arrived and completely untested in combat, was placed there for precisely that reason, because nothing, everyone agreed, was ever going to happen there. Adolf Hitler had staked the last strength of his army on that assumption being wrong. In near total secrecy, moving men and machines under cover of darkness and bad flying weather, the Germans assembled a massive strike force in the forests directly opposite that quiet American line. More than 200,000 troops, nearly 1,000 tanks and armored vehicles. 2 full panzer armies formed the tip of the spear, a 6th Panzer Army in the north and a 5th Panzer Army beside it. The plan, code-named Watch on the Rhine, was audacious to the point of desperation. The Germans would smash through the weak, sleepy American line in the Ardennes, drive hard to the northwest, force a crossing of the Meuse River, and seize the vital Belgian port of Antwerp, through which the Allies funneled their supplies. In doing so, they would split the American and British armies cleanly apart and, Hitler gambled, shock the Western Allies into negotiating a separate peace. It was the last great offensive roll of the dice for Nazi Germany in the West. On the morning of December 16, 1944, it fell on the unsuspecting Americans like a hammer out of the fog. Before dawn, along a front stretching roughly 100 miles, the German artillery erupted in a barrage so sudden and so violent that men who had never yet heard a shot fired in anger were plunged straight into the heart of a firestorm. Then the assault infantry came pouring out of the trees, and behind them the tanks. Along much of the line, stunned and badly outnumbered American units were overrun, surrounded, or simply shattered where they stood. The Green 106th Infantry Division was gutted almost immediately. 2 of its regiments, encircled in the high ground called the Schnee Eifel and rapidly running short of ammunition and food, were forced to surrender in one of the largest mass surrenders of American troops in the entire war. As the German spearheads punched westward, the front line on the situation maps began to bend, then to swell inward, into a great ugly bulge pushing into Allied-held territory. And it was that shape, that ominous swelling, that gave the whole battle the blunt, unforgettable name history would keep for it, the Bulge. What followed was roughly 5 weeks of some of the most brutal fighting American soldiers endured anywhere in the war, in some of the worst conditions imaginable. It was one of the coldest, snowiest winters in living memory. Men froze to death in their foxholes. Frostbite cases flooded the aid stations right alongside the shrapnel wounds. At a snowy crossroads near the Belgian town of Malmedy, a group of American soldiers who had already surrendered were herded into a field and machine-gunned, one of the most infamous atrocities committed against American troops in the West. Word of that massacre raced up and down the line and hardened every man who heard it. And at the vital road hub of Bastogne, where 7 roads met, and whoever held the town-controlled movement for miles around, the encircled American defenders, including the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, held on through siege and freezing fog and constant attack. When the surrounding Germans sent in a formal demand for surrender, the American commander sent back a reply of a single word, a word so blunt and so American that it passed instantly into legend. But the truth about how the German offensive was actually broken lies a little to the north of famous Bastogne, in a place far fewer people can name. Because while the cameras and the war correspondents were largely fixed on the drama of the encircled paratroopers, the real backbreaker of Hitler's offensive happened along a stretch of high ground called Elsenborn Ridge, on the northern shoulder of the Bulge. There, the green and untested men of the 99th Infantry Division, joined by the battle-hardened veterans of the 2nd Infantry Division, dug into the frozen high ground and simply refused to be moved. Against them, Hitler had thrown some of his very best units, including the fanatical 12th SS Panzer Division. And there, on that ridge, the Germans were stopped cold. It was the one sector of the entire American front during the battle where the German attack failed to advance at all. What made that stand possible points straight back to the theme running under this entire story. It was, above all, American artillery and the intelligence and coordination that directed it. Along and behind that ridge, the Americans massed an astonishing concentration of guns, well over 300 pieces, able to answer a call for fire from almost any threatened point on the line within minutes. When fresh German infantry burst out of the tree line and charged up the open slopes, they ran straight into a wall of steel and explosives so dense that entire attacking formations were simply annihilated in the open. The German timetable, the delicate schedule on which the whole gamble depended, was wrecked on that ridge. Their spearheads were forced off their planned roads and funneled south into confusion and traffic and delay. The historian John Eisenhower, himself the son of the Supreme Allied Commander, would later write that the action of those 2 divisions on the northern shoulder could be considered the most decisive of the entire Ardennes campaign. The Germans never secured the northern flank they needed, and because they never secured it, the whole offensive was doomed from within, whatever happened at Bastogne. By the time the battle was formally declared over in late January 1945, the cost was staggering. American forces suffered on the order of 80,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured and missing. The official count of American dead runs to more than 19,000 men. More than 20,000 American soldiers were taken prisoner. By any measure, it was the largest and bloodiest single battle the United States Army fought in the whole of the Second World War, and it accounts for something close to 1/10 of all American combat casualties in that war. Winston Churchill would rise in the House of Commons and call it an ever-famous American victory, but it was a victory bought at a terrible price. And here is the part that matters most for our story. It began with a failure to see what the enemy was so obviously doing, in the exact region where seeing the enemy first was supposed to be the entire point of having an army in the field. And this is the thread that runs directly back to Guy Stern and the Ritchie boys, and pulls the whole story tight. Because the Bulge was, before it was anything else, a failure to read the enemy correctly. The Germans achieved their shattering surprise, not because they had somehow become invisible. They achieved it because the men on the Allied side, whose entire job was to interpret the signs, had already convinced themselves that the signs could not mean what they plainly meant. Prisoners captured in the days before the offensive had dropped hints of a great build-up. Fragments of worrying information had drifted up the chain of command, but at the highest and most comfortable levels, the alarming picture was waved away. The reassuring story, "The enemy is finished and cannot possibly attack," was simply more pleasant to believe than the terrifying one, "The enemy is massing in the fog for a knockout blow." In a battle defined from its first hour by that exact failure, the value of men who could quickly, accurately, and in flawless German pry the actual truth out of a captured enemy soldier becomes almost impossible to overstate. There is a single, well-documented exception to the great intelligence failure that proves the point perfectly, and it deserves to be remembered right alongside the failure itself. On the American side, one senior intelligence officer had flatly refused to be lulled to sleep. Colonel Oscar Koch, the intelligence chief for General Patton's Third Army, had spent weeks quietly, stubbornly tracking the small, methodical signs of a German buildup gathering opposite the Ardennes. Rail movements, radio patterns, prisoner scraps. And in early December, at a staff briefing, he laid his warning on the table, that the Germans still retained both the capacity and quite possibly the intention to strike a heavy blow. Because Patton listened to his intelligence officer rather than dismissing him, Third Army had already begun quiet contingency planning before the German blow ever landed. And that is the deepest reason why, once the offensive hit, Patton was able to perform one of the great feats of the war, wheeling an entire army 90 degrees out of one battle and driving it north through winter roads to smash into the flank of the Bulge and relieve Bastogne. The lesson written across the whole battle is stark and simple. Where the enemy was read correctly, disaster was blunted. Where he was not, disaster arrived at dawn. Intelligence was never a sideshow to the Battle of the Bulge. It was the very hinge on which the entire thing swung. So where, in all of this, was Guy Stern? Not, it must be said plainly and honestly, crouched in a frozen foxhole at Bastogne with a rifle. That was not his war, and it does no honor to the truth to pretend otherwise. His war was fought at a different station, and it was no less essential to the outcome for being fought behind the front. After landing in Normandy just 3 days after the D-Day invasion, wading into his job so quickly that he was interrogating his first prisoner within minutes of coming ashore, Stern had been attached to the headquarters of the 1st United States Army, the very army holding that critical northern half of the Ardennes front. He was one member of a small 6-man team of interrogators of prisoners of war, a unit designated Team 41, and as the long campaign across France and Belgium wore on, he was handed a responsibility that revealed exactly how much value the army had finally learned to place on men like him. Stern's commanding officers put him in charge of what was called a survey section. Its job was to pull together and to make genuine sense of the vast flood of raw information pouring out of hundreds upon hundreds of individual prisoner interrogations. This was intelligence work of a particularly powerful and underappreciated kind. Any single captured German soldier, questioned on his own, might know only a very little: the location of his own company, a rumor about fuel, a complaint about his officers. Taken alone, each fragment was nearly worthless. But if you could question enough of them, systematically, and then lay all their small answers side by side and compare them, patterns began to rise up out of the noise, patterns that no individual prisoner could ever see, and that no single interrogation could ever reveal. It was the difference between staring at one meaningless tile and stepping back to see the whole mosaic. Stern's job, and his gift, was assembling the mosaic. And the questions that mosaic could answer were, quite literally, matters of life and death for thousands of Allied soldiers. Consider one example that shows the method at its most elegant. There was a deep, persistent Allied fear, running through the entire war, that a cornered and increasingly desperate Nazi Germany might finally resort to chemical weapons, to poison gas, as it was pushed back toward its own borders. The memory of gas warfare from the First World War was still fresh and horrifying, but how could you possibly know, in advance, whether the enemy was preparing to unleash it? You could not simply see an intention hiding inside the enemy's high command. Yet Stern found a way to read that intention indirectly, through a back door. As ordinary prisoners came through the cages, he and his colleagues could ask a small, almost boring administrative question. How many of your men are still carrying their gas masks? Think about the logic. If the German army were truly preparing to fight on a poisoned battlefield, it would first make certain its own soldiers were equipped to survive it. The presence or absence of gas masks in the ranks was a quiet signal of intent that no general could easily hide. The pattern in the prisoners' answers told the story clearly. The evidence indicated that the Germans were not, in fact, preparing to wage gas warfare. That single strategic reassurance, assembled from hundreds of small, ordinary, almost mundane questions, was worth more to the Allied command than any dramatic act of individual heroism. Stern's teams turned the same patient method loose on other urgent questions. How quickly could the Germans repair their railways and factories after Allied bombing, which spoke directly to how fast the enemy could rush men and supplies to a threatened front? What was the true fighting strength, and just as importantly the true morale, of the last scraped-together divisions that Germany was flinging into the line? This was the work of reading an entire war machine from the inside out, one frightened and talkative prisoner at a time. And for his method of mass interrogation, for the systematic questioning that turned the raw fear and chatter of captured men into hard, usable, life-saving intelligence, Guy Stern was awarded the Bronze Star. But it was in the way these men worked, in the sheer psychological craft of it, that their peculiar genius truly lived. And here Stern left behind one of the most memorable accounts in the entire Ritchie Boy story. He and a fellow German-born interrogator named Fred Howard developed a routine together. In its bones, it was the oldest trick in the interrogator's book, the hard man and the reasonable man, what a later generation would come to call good cop and bad cop. But Stern and Howard gave it a devastating local twist, one that only men who understood the German soldier's mind from the inside could ever have invented. They understood one thing above almost all else about the ordinary German prisoner captured in the West. He was afraid, more than of nearly anything, of one particular fate. Being handed over to the Soviets, the war on the Eastern Front had been a horror beyond description on both sides, and German soldiers had been fed years of terrifying propaganda about the barbarism that awaited any German who fell into Russian hands. Stern learned to weaponize that specific terror. He would sometimes assume a role, playing a menacing Soviet liaison officer, a commissar, complete with a thick Russian accent that he had, of all places, absorbed from an American comedy program on the radio back in the States. The threat was never spoken crudely or directly. It simply hung in the cold air of the tent. Cooperate fully and reasonably with the pleasant American officer sitting across the table, or find yourself transferred into the custody of this frightening Russian and shipped east. Prisoners who had stubbornly resisted every straightforward question would suddenly discover that their memories had improved dramatically. It was pure theater. It was manipulation of the most calculated kind. And, crucially, it stayed entirely within the bounds of the laws of war, because it was built on fear and deception rather than on any act of violence. It worked because the men running the performance knew, from the inside, precisely which fears their former countrymen carried in their hearts. Now we come to the hardest part of this story, and it must be told with care and with precision, because it is the part most often exaggerated in the retelling, and the plain truth of it needs no exaggeration at all to break your heart. The Ritchie boys, who were German-born Jews, carried a particular and terrible risk that their American-born comrades simply did not. Every American soldier feared death and feared capture. But if a German-born Jew wearing an American uniform were captured by the Germans and his origins were discovered, he was in far greater danger than an ordinary prisoner of war. In the twisted eyes of the Nazi state, he was not merely an enemy soldier entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention. He was a Jew, and worse, a German Jew who had escaped and come back in the uniform of the enemy. He was, to them, a traitor twice over, and the ordinary protections owed to a captured soldier could, in an instant, simply evaporate. This was not an abstract or theoretical fear that the Ritchie boys carried. In the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, It came true in the worst possible way. When the German offensive smashed into the 106th Infantry Division in those first catastrophic days, among the thousands of Americans swept up into captivity were the members of an interrogation team attached to that division. A team numbered 154. Two of its men were German-born Jews, refugees turned interrogators, exactly like Guy Stern. Their names were Kurt Jacobs and Murray Zappler. In the confusion of the great mass surrender near the town of Blealf, two German soldiers who had just been freed from American captivity pointed the pair out to a German officer, telling him that these two prisoners spoke fluent German. That officer, a captain named Kurt Bruns, had the two men brought before him. He asked them whether they had been interrogating his soldiers, and under his questioning, it emerged that they were German Jews. And then he uttered a sentence that distilled the entire monstrous ideology the Ritchie boys were fighting into a few plain words. He said that the Jews had no right to live in Germany. Kurt Jacobs and Murray Zappler were marched a short distance down a road, away from the other prisoners, and shot. Their bodies were found that February by American soldiers of the 12th Infantry Regiment, lying in a shallow hole about 100 yards off the road, their boots taken. And here the machinery of justice began to turn, powered in significant part by the very kind of patient intelligence work that the Ritchie boys existed to perform. The murders first came to light not through the discovery of the bodies, but through the testimony of a captured German soldier from Bruns's own unit, an eyewitness whose account was on the record before the bodies were ever recovered. That man was a former concentration camp prisoner, a German communist who had been forced into the army late in the war, and he came forward because he wanted the crime reported. From there, American military intelligence built its case methodically. Investigators questioned witnesses. They tracked the officer responsible, and after 3 weeks of searching, they found and arrested Captain Bruns in a bunker. In a striking measure of how seriously the American command took the crime, Bruns was brought before a military commission appointed by the commanding general of the First Army, and put on trial while the war itself was still being fought, in April 1945. He was convicted of the murder of Jacobs and Zappler. He was sentenced to death, and that summer he was executed by firing squad, becoming the first German war criminal to be put to death by the United States Army for a crime committed in the Second World War. Now it is tempting, and many popular retellings give in fully to the temptation, to place Guy Stern himself personally at the very center of that case, to say that he alone tracked the killer down and cracked it open. The honest historical record is more collective, and in a way it is far more powerful for being so. This was not one man's personal vengeance carried out in secret. It was the entire system that the Ritchie boys embodied, the systematic questioning of prisoners, the patient reading of the enemy through his own words, turned now toward justice for two of their own. Jacobs and Zappler died for exactly the reason that made Stern himself valuable, and exactly the reason that made him a target. They were refugees who had come back to fight the regime that had cast them out, and the case that brought their killer before a firing squad was built with precisely the skills that Stern and his fellow Ritchie boys had been trained at Camp Ritchie to wield. When Stern spoke, many decades later, about the peculiar double nature of their service, he put it with a clarity that has never been improved upon. They were fighting an American war, he said, and at the very same time an intensely personal one, and they were in it with every last inch of their being. There was another, quieter danger that shadowed these men constantly, and it says a great deal about how strange their position truly was. Their perfect German, the very thing that made them so valuable, could just as easily get them killed by their own side. A Ritchie boy speaking accented English at a checkpoint in the dark, or overheard rattling off fluent German, could be mistaken for an enemy infiltrator. That fear was especially sharp during the Bulge, because the Germans really had sent English-speaking commandos in captured American uniforms behind the lines to spread confusion and cut communications. Passwords and challenges at checkpoints became a matter of life and death, and there was the small, terrible detail of the dog tags. The American military of that era stamped each soldier's religion onto his metal identification tags. For a Jewish soldier who stood any chance of being captured, that single letter stamped into the metal was a mortal danger hanging around his own neck. Many of these men understood exactly what they were carrying and exactly what it could cost them, on every single day that they served. Step back now and look at the whole astonishing shape of what these rejected men accomplished, because the scale of it is genuinely startling. After the war, one United States Army assessment estimated that a very large share of the actionable combat intelligence gathered on the Western Front, a figure that is often cited as high as 60%, came from the work of the Ritchie boys. That specific number deserves an honest note of caution, and it is better to give it than to hide it. Careful historians point out that such a clean, round figure almost certainly does not fully account for the enormous, secret contribution of Allied code-breaking, and it is probably too tidy to take completely literally. But even generously discounted, even carefully hedged, that estimate points at something real and remarkable and undeniable. The very men whom the enemy alien policy had tried its best to keep out of the war altogether ended up producing a share of its battlefield intelligence so large that the army itself, looking back, struggled to put a modest number on it. The rejected became, by a wide margin, some of the most productive intelligence soldiers that the United States put into the field. And they did it, crucially, in exactly the kind of war that the Battle of the Bulge so perfectly represented. A war in which the decisive question was very often not simply who had more men or more steel, enormous as that mattered, but who could correctly understand what the other side was about to do before he did it. The Germans in December 1944 had won their terrible early surprise precisely by exploiting comfortable Allied assumptions and a failure of Allied understanding, and the long, grinding, bloody work of pushing them back across that winter and of never again being surprised so badly depended utterly on prying loose the truth from every captured soldier, every seized map, every intercepted order. That was the entire reason the Ritchie boys existed. In the war of understanding the enemy, the rejected refugees were not a minor supporting act somewhere off stage. They were a primary weapon. Which brings us all the way back around to the young sergeant in the tent, to the two rejections that opened this account, and to what they truly mean when you finally set them against everything that followed. The United States turned Guy Stern away in two different ways. The first time, a naval recruiter looked at a gifted young man who spoke the enemy's language as a native and understood the enemy from the inside, and saw only a foreigner to be sent home. The second time, an entire legal and bureaucratic apparatus looked at tens of thousands of fiercely anti-Nazi refugees and saw, by cautious default, a category of suspects to be held safely at arm's length. Both of those rejections were made for reasons that felt, at the moment, like simple prudence, and both of them were, in the plainest possible terms, mistakes. They mistook the exact source of a man's greatest possible usefulness for the reason to throw him away. What redeemed those mistakes was not that Stern happened, through luck, to slip through a crack. It was that a handful of clearer-eyed people inside the American military looked at the very same refugees the policy had walled off and asked the better question. They understood that a man who had lost everything he had to Nazi Germany, who spoke its language perfectly, who grasped its fears and its pride and its lies from the inside, was not a liability to be nervously managed. He was an asset that the enemy could never, ever replicate. Germany could not manufacture a single soldier who understood America the way Guy Stern understood Germany, for one simple and damning reason. Germany had spent years methodically driving out exactly the kind of people who could have understood its enemies. The Nazis had thrown away their own best potential minds on the altar of their ideology, expelling and murdering the very Jews, scholars, and outsiders who might have served them. The United States, after very nearly making the same blind error at the recruiting office door, changed its mind just in time to turn those discarded people into one of its sharpest instruments. That is the quiet, unglamorous truth sitting at the heart of the Battle of the Bulge that so rarely makes it into the films. The battle is remembered, and rightly so, for the frozen heroism of the men at Bastogne, for the unyielding stand on the ridge at Elsenborn, for Patton's astonishing pivot north through the snow. But underneath all of that visible drama, there ran a constant, invisible river of information, and a great deal of that river was fed by men who sat in cold tents and talked quietly to prisoners in flawless native German. Some of those men had been rejected outright by the country they were now serving. Some of them, like Kurt Jacobs and Murray Zappler, paid for that service with their lives, murdered for the precise reason that they had dared to come back and fight. And one of them, a scholar's son from Hildesheim who had been turned away twice over, spent the coldest and most dangerous weeks of that winter at a field army headquarters, patiently assembling, out of 1,000 frightened voices, the clear picture that his commanders so badly needed to see. Guy Stern survived the war. In its final days, he walked into the newly liberated concentration camp at Buchenwald and confronted with his own eyes the full scale of what the regime he had fought had actually done. Not long after, he learned with terrible certainty what had become of the family he had tried so hard, as a teenage boy, to save. That his mother and father and his brother and his sister had been swallowed into the Warsaw Ghetto and killed. He carried that knowledge and that unearned survivor's grief for the rest of a very long life. He returned to America and became a scholar, a distinguished professor of German literature, devoting himself to the study of the very culture that had produced both the poetry he had loved as a boy and the regime that had murdered his family. He gave his later decades to Holocaust remembrance, working to make sure the world could not forget. He lived to be 101 years old, dying in December 2023, among the very last of the surviving Ritchie boys. It would have been so easy, so terribly easy, for the United States to have lost him entirely. One recruiter's caution, one bureaucratic category on a selective service card, and the young man with the perfect German and the personal fury and the scholar's endless patience would have spent the whole war stocking shelves in St. Louis or filling out forms in an office somewhere, his particular and irreplaceable genius left completely unused. That very nearly happened, and it very nearly happened not once but tens of thousands of times over, to an entire population of gifted people whom the enemy had discarded and whom the ally, in its first frightened instinct, nearly discarded in turn. So the real lesson of Guy Stern is not simply the satisfying one, that a single rejected man rose against the odds to a kind of greatness. The deeper lesson is about the strange arithmetic of what actually makes a person valuable, and about how easily fear can turn that arithmetic exactly upside down. The very qualities that got Stern rejected at the door, his foreign birth, his German tongue, his intimate inside knowledge of the enemy, were the precise qualities that made him nearly irreplaceable once someone finally thought to use them. A frightened bureaucracy read those qualities as danger and turned him away. A wiser corner of the same institution read the identical qualities as power and put them to work. The whole difference between those two readings, multiplied across 20,000 men and women, helped decide how clearly the Allies could see their enemy in the darkest, coldest, most desperate battle of the Western War. The German captain who ordered the murder of Kurt Jacobs and Murray Zappler believed, and said aloud, that men like them had no right even to exist. He said it, and then he killed 2 prisoners to prove that he meant it. The deepest and most fitting answer to that belief was not, in the end, delivered by the firing squad that took his life, real and necessary as that justice was. The answer was delivered instead on every single day of that long winter, in 100 cold canvas tents strung out behind the American line. It was delivered by rejected refugees in American uniforms who sat down calmly across from captured German soldiers and, quietly and expertly and in perfect native German, drew out of them the very information that would help destroy the regime that had cast those refugees out. They had been told, twice over, in 2 different countries, that they did not belong, and their answer, patient and precise and devastating, was simply to make themselves indispensable. If this account gave you something worth carrying with you, a like helps it reach more people who care about this kind of history, and subscribing means the next forgotten story finds its way to you. Because the history that gets remembered is almost always the history of the visible. the tanks and the generals and the famous last stands at the crossroads. But some of the men and women who mattered most in the Battle of the Bulge were the ones that almost no one ever saw. The ones the war machine had very nearly refused at the door, doing quiet, patient, decisive work in a language that was supposed to have condemned them and that instead helped to save them, and helped, in the end, to win.